This is the Financially Simple Podcast, a show dedicated to destroying the complexities of money for today's small business owner. And now, here's your host, pizza-loving, certified financial planner, Justin Goodbread.
Welcome to Financially Simple. This is a finance show for small business owners about money, how it works in our business and personal lives, and how we can build wealth to be financially independent. I'm your host, Justin Goodbread, and today we're dealing with the topic, the flaw in the Dupont company formula. So inevitably, whenever you start talking about growing the value of a company, inevitably, if you're dealing with any sort of educated individual who has been taught through formal education means, the Dupont formula is inevitably going to come up. It just is. And I want to deal with the flaw in this particular formula in today's environment. Now, in order to understand the flaw, we first have to understand the formula. Now, you might recognize the name DuPont, right? I mean, it's NASCAR. We see the DuPont car running around the NASCAR track. Now, I got to tell you, I'm not a fan of NASCAR. I know I'm a little bit country. I know I'm a little bit rock and roll, as the old song goes, but I have a hard time watching cars go around and around in circles. I just do. It's not my cup of tea, man. So forgive me. But nonetheless, we see the DuPont car. We also have the DuPont series in NASCAR. So we recognize that DuPont is currently a large painting company, but they do so much more. What I didn't realize is that DuPont had actually been around since 1919, actually before then. But the DuPont formula came around in 1919. And the formula actually began being utilized in 1920s by the DuPont Corporation. So the formula came about during a period of time when the chemical giant was known as being one of the most financially sophisticated and innovative corporations on the planet. And DuPont contributed to the modernization of the developed world by bringing in new techniques, understanding, insights, all into management. And these modern ideas way back in 1919, which is a long time ago for me, and techniques, all these ideas and techniques were adopted throughout the various sectors and other industries at that time. And because of the implementation of this particular methodology, productivity increased along with standard of livings around Americans who really had no idea why they were collecting these proverbial, quote, dividends. And after this became the Industrial Revolution. The DuPont model is very valuable. It is. It has some validity to it. It's very valuable because it doesn't just want to know what the return on equity is. Now, we've talked about return on equity in the past podcast. But this model doesn't just deal with return on equity. Rather, it's going to allow you to know what the specific variables are which causes the return on equity in the first place. So it measures and it highlights the underlying realities. And it becomes easier to target and to develop corporate policies to improve and modify the areas to optimization. And ultimately, you can take control through the intellectual, purposeful, and decisive actions. That is kind of the quick summary of the DuPont formula. Whenever you look at the DuPont formula, an experienced investor or someone who is looking at buying our businesses may consider the DuPont formula as a technique for evaluating our businesses. And this formula, by the way, is taught a lot in MBA classes today. One of my dear friends who just graduated from the MBA program, he said, Justin, I was just starting about the DuPont formula. I'm like, oh yeah, interesting. I'm getting ready to do a podcast on that. And he's like, really? What are your thoughts? I was like, well, I'm going to deal with why it's flawed. And there was crickets on the phone. He goes, what do you mean flawed? That was like the heartbeat of my particular class I just took. I say, oh, okay, well, you have to tune into the podcast. So he's going to listen to what he said. But nonetheless, it's taught a lot today in many MBA programs. No, not all. We know that. But the cool thing about it is it does allow an experienced investor or a manager to look at the return on equity model, the ROE, return on equity, breakdown almost instantly. And you can gain insight from the capital structure of the firm. You can gain insight from the quality of the business and the levers that are driving the return on the invested capital. So one person I read said it's akin to opening up a car engine and ascertaining the individual components of making it run. That's the way they describe the Dupont Formula. Now, whenever I was in high school, my dad and I rebuilt a motor. We actually worked along with a mechanic, and we rebuilt a motor in my truck. And I can remember the first time I saw how pistons worked and how lifters and camshaft and crankshaft and all these different things worked together. And once I could see how it worked together, I understood how a motor worked. Up until that point, I realized you had to have oil and you had to have gas, but I didn't understand the motor itself. And after that, I understood, here's how a motor works. And then I can understand going forward that if certain things within the motor are not working properly, you can hear it sometimes. You know what results to look for. So one particular author I read said, the Dupont Formula is like looking at the inner workings of a motor, of an engine, but only for your business. What is the Dupont Formula? In its purest sense, I want you to think of 3 different silos. I was driving by a cornfield not too long ago as we were driving up to Boston. We were going through, I believe it was eastern Pennsylvania, and there's this really cool, picturesque farm, and it had 3 corn silos, or 3 silos. I knew they were using corn because they were uploading at that particular point into the silos. But I want you to think of 3 silos. And the first silo that the Dupont Formula analyzes is what's called the revenue growth of an organization, or some people call it enterprise. So it's the revenue growth of the enterprise. And whenever you look at the revenue growth, they're looking at the volume and the price. What's the volume of flow and what's the current pricing models? And the way that the Dupont Formula deals with revenue growth is it deals with branding, market position, products and service innovation, and ultimately price optimization. So today's terminology, we call this sales and marketing. Those are the 2 sales and marketing components. And by the way, if you remember to one of our last podcasts, we talked about a piece of the pizza, I said, but are 2 of the 8 key components of business is sales and marketing. So way back in 1919, the Dupont Formula nailed it on the head, showing that the revenue growth of an organization, the volume of revenue and the pricing points of it is all part of sales and marketing. Friends, nothing has changed. I was reading a book of Ecclesiastes in the Bible, and it said inside there, nothing is new under the sun. In other words, on this earth, nothing is new. Now, we may develop new things, we may discover new things, but really nothing's new. We're noticing, once again, business is business is business. It hasn't changed. It hasn't changed in over 100 years. So here we are looking at the Dupont Formula from 1919, and we're in the year 2018 now, almost 100 years ago. And we're seeing that sales and marketing is once again in our face. So the first silo is revenue growth, and that's dealing with sales and marketing. The next silo is operating margin. And so in here, you're going to have SG&A, the letter S, G, the and symbol, and A. And that's the way you typically see on accounting reports. And that stands for selling, general, and administration expenses. So people just say S, G, and A. So in this operation margin, you're going to look at your S, G, and A, or your expenses. You're going to look at your cost of goods sold, and you're going to examine your taxation. And by looking at those 3 things, you can derive numbers of things from it. You can look at the product level, the product delivery, the promotion, the cost optimization strategies. You can look at the operations. And here we go. We're now diving into another 2 slices of our 8 models, and that is people and operations. So again, way back 100 years ago now, almost, the Dupont Formula announced that if you look at the operating margin of a business, which consists of SG&A, your general expenses, your cost of goods sold, and your taxes, that you're going to be able to identify or help increase the value of your company. And that is people and operations. So therefore, in the first 2 silos, we already have 50%. We already have 4 of the 8 key components of business. The reason why I bring this out at this point is because, friends, nothing's new here. Business has operated as business for millennia, even for decades, even for centuries. We've operated business in the same way. In order to drive revenue, you have to market, you have to have sales. In order to have operating margin, you have to have good people, and you have to have good operations. Then you look at the third silo. The third silo is I'm driving by the cornfield there in Pennsylvania. The third silo in the Dupont Formula is what's called asset efficiency. And that you're going to examine the working capital. We dealt with that here recently, working capital. You're going to look at the asset utilization. And in those 2 components, we're dealing with accounts receivable. We're dealing with inventory. We're dealing with price per earnings ratio. We're dealing with CapEx. We're dealing with tax efficiency. We're dealing with capital structure. Ultimately, we're working with finance, and leadership.
You are listening to Financially Simple, destroying the complexities of money for today's small business owner.
Those are the three silos of the Dupont Formula. And Dupont leaves it at that. They leave it at focus on revenue growth, which is volume and price. Focus on operating margin, which is your expenses, your cost of goods, and your taxes. And focus on asset efficiency, which is working capital and utilization of assets. And friends, that makes a lot of sense because you're dealing with 6 of the 8 areas of business, which we talked about last week. So you're dealing with sales and marketing, you're dealing with the people in the operations, and you're dealing with finance and legal. But here's where it's flawed. At this point in today's conversation, the way that businesses are valued today, if all we focus on is sales and marketing, people and operations, and financing and legal, it's no wonder why so many of our businesses don't sell because we miss one very key component. And this information I first saw within the corporate value metrics model. It's CVGA, Corporate Value Growth Advisors. And that's the credential I have. I'm a certified value growth advisor. The first time I saw this last silo, another 4th silo, was as I was taking the certified value growth advisor designation. And what is that? And why do I feel like the Dupont formula is flawed? And here's why. Today, with the way our world works, we have to deal with the business architecture. We have to know how the governance of the business works. We have to know the structure of the business. We have to know the systems within the business. Those all matter. Ultimately, there's an acronym that I'm going to use called VMOSTA. VMOSTA, VMOSTA. And VMOSTA stands for we need to know the vision, the mission, the objectives, the strategies, the tactics, and the actions. We need to understand those things for today's companies. We have to understand the culture. We have to understand the communication. We have to understand the incentives within the organization. We have to understand all these things. Why? Because the things have slightly changed. Today we have technology. Today we have a whole different world of young business owners coming on the scenes. Many of us have been coined as a snotty group of Generation X and millennials. I heard just today in a meeting, somebody in their 70s was picking on millennials. And I'm like, time out, Chief. I'm one of these guys you're picking on. And he just looked at me. He goes, well, you're not like the rest of them. I said, buddy, there's so many, quote, millennials, which I hate being called that, or Gen X. I hate being called those. I said, man, there's so many millennials. Man, we're not dumb. We got a good head on our shoulders. And then I looked at him. I said, do you realize that millennials have a savings rate at almost twice of your current savings rate from your generation and almost 4 times that of the baby boomers? And he just looked at me like, huh? I'm like, yeah, okay. All right, Gramps. So we were having fun. Go easy. Anyways, we were talking. I said, man, today's generation, we want to understand why. The last generations, they would just step in, lock, stop, and just go do it. Today, we ask the question, why? We want a cause. We want to be part of something. And friends, if you're thinking about selling a business in the next 10 years, in the next 15 years as part of your retirement, chances are you're not selling it to a traditionalist, someone in their 70s and 80s right now. You're probably not going to sell it to somebody who's a baby boomer. You may pull in a Gen X who just has some money they want to fly out. But more than likely, you're going to be dealing with a late Gen X or a millennial who's going to buy your business. So if that is the case, where the Dupont formula fails at is in the last 2 pieces of the 8 models, and that is planning and leadership. This is why whenever Jack Welch came on the scene with GE in the 1980s and 90s, that whenever Jack Welch came on and he began dealing with Six Sigma, which I don't remember exactly all the details in that, but I remember that was in the case, he dealt with planning and leadership. Why? Because for a century, at least now, at that point for decades, people had focused on sales and marketing, people in operations, finances, and legal, but we forgot one of the key components, and that is, if you don't have a plan, you plan to fail, as someone once said. You have to know where you're headed. You have to know the vision of the company. You have to know the culture of the company and how you're going to move that culture toward the effective vision. Then you have to be able to lead multiple different generations. You know, back in 1919, whenever the Dupont formula was first introduced, you didn't have people living in their 70s and 80s consistently like you do now. I have many, many, many clients and heritage investors that we do estate planning and retirement planning work for them, and they're in their 70s, 80s. We have several 90-year-olds. I mean, in 1918, you didn't have that happen. Here we are in 2018, and now you have people living into centennials. You have 100-year-olds plus. And I read a study not too long ago that said my generation, the people born in the early, I don't even know what I am. I was born in 79, so I'm Gen X, maybe a millennial. I'm somewhere in that range. My generation, my age group, could live 100 years plus consistently because of exponential technologies. So if that's the case, friends, we cannot remove planning and leadership of the organization. If you don't focus on planning and leadership equally to that of finance and legal, people and operations, and sales and marketing, then you're going to miss a great potential for potential buyer in the future. So while the Dupont formula is very valid, I agree. We have to focus on sales and marketing, which is a revenue growth. We have to know the people and operations, which the Dupont formula calls operating margin. We have to know our finance and legal. We have to deal with that, which is what's called an asset efficiency. All those areas are fundamental, but we also have to deal with planning and leadership. Inevitably, we're going to hear the Dupont formula. It's going to come up sometime or another as you start learning about growing the value of your business. I don't have a problem with the formula. I just think it's missing planning and leadership. So we're going to deal with these 8 key areas. We're going to deal with planning and leadership. We're going to start there. And then we're going to work around our wagon wheel to look at all the different areas of growing the value of our company. Now look, outside of planning and leadership, most of these things have been around for many, 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 many decades. Now, the tactics are changed, but the concepts haven't. They're still the same. Let's make our lives financially simple as we journey through how to grow the value of our companies. See, friends, I'm a business owner. My company is one of my largest assets. It's not quite my largest, but it's one of my largest assets right now. And I want to make it successful. I want to see a return on my equity, return on my asset, depending on which way you want to measure it, of higher than I can perform through the stock market. Now, am I knocking the stock market? No. We're going to have episodes about that, when you use it, when you don't use it. I want my business to perform better than my real estate holdings. Am I knocking real estate? No. But I want it to grow. So, guys, that's it for this episode. I'm going to have on this particular episode a graphic on our blog, financiallysimple.com, under the heading podcast. This is episode number 75. And I'm going to have a graphic on there which outlines the current Dupont formula with the modifications that I have. And actually, this is the information that I received directly as I was learning the Certified Value Growth Advisor credential. A year's worth of study and research to go in and sit for that exam. But this is some good information. Hey, look, I'm getting a ton of friends now on Facebook, people asking me questions on Instagram. I'm building up a list of questions. If you have any questions particularly, we're getting ready to start working on our 4th quarter show, and I want to answer some questions. So if you hear this and you say, Justin, I'd really like for you to go back and visit this, or, hey, Justin, can you answer this following question for me? Shoot me a message through social media. Connect with me. Share one of the podcasts. I'd appreciate it. Hey, look, like I say every week, life is hard. Life is good. Life can be frustrating. Money doesn't have to be. Let's continue to make our lives at least financially simple. Y'all go out and make it a great day.
You have been listening to the Financially Simple podcast. The information in this show is for informational purposes only. This show is not investment advice. Instead, seek help from a competent financial advisor. Justin Goodbread, CFP, is an investment advisor representative of Heritage Investors, a registered investment advisor.